An increasing number of companies have been interested in the topics of supply chain visibility, transparency, and mapping, and they've been faced with situations like having to comply with the recent Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. So at Insight Quality, we've helped a number of our clients in recent years to audit their suppliers to get a better view of their entire supply chain and what's really going on. So today I am joined by Andy Church, and we are going to talk about the topic of supply chain visibility and how to audit your supply chain. So let's just jump right into it. As I've said, in the last few years, people have been concerned with supply chain mapping, supply chain visibility, and supply chain transparency. And so we're throwing out these terms, but I'm wondering if we can get your take on what these terms mean and why they're such a big concern for importers.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, I think that transparency, mapping, and visibility all have a lot of overlap. I mean, mapping would be the act of detailing out each supplier in the supply chain, starting with the finished good. Can you trace back the raw material of each component that makes up a finished good and map all of that? So, you would have potentially a cotton farm, and then the processor, maybe the dyer, and then the actual cut and sew, which is where they make a finished garment. Say, visibility, I think is for me when I think about it is seeing that, the mapping out, seeing it, and then transparency is again, I think a lot of overlap is, is that information available? Is the factory, do they have that? And are they sharing that with their supplier? And so are they being transparent and sharing information? So, there's a lot of overlap, and that's my take on the definitions. I don't know if you want to clarify or add anything to those, Billy, but that's how I see those three terms in specific talking about auditing.
Yeah, the one thing that I would just add about transparency is it could also mean, the company's transparency with their customers. So they're importing these goods from different suppliers in different countries, and they're kind of sharing that information with the end consumer. So that's just kind of another thing to add on about transparency. But, on this topic, um, I'd like to talk about auditing. So we've talked about what these things are, and audits are a way to get better visibility and map your supply chain. So so how does auditing help importers to get better visibility of their suppliers and sub-suppliers?
The act of an audit is verifying processes. Are there processes, and are they in place, and are those processes being followed? And so when Insight is engaged to conduct an audit of a factory, and part of that audit includes either supplier mapping, visibility into the suppliers of the raw materials that the factory is using in the production of their product. Insight would review documentation. We would review the factories. Do they have a vetting process for their suppliers? And if so, are they following it? So is the factory auditing their suppliers? When Insight's engaged to audit a factory who's producing, I'll stay with the example of apparel, a shirt, we audit that apparel manufacturing site and the processes that are in place there and being implemented, and are they being implemented and used. We are not engaged to then audit up the supply chain to the mill or the farm, but a factory, if in their processes they have audits of their suppliers, we would look to ensure that they are doing those audits and they have the records. And so an audit of a factory will give our clients visibility into the processes being undertaken by the factory and transparency into the process and allow for mapping. And one of the concerns, I might get ahead of some of the questions you have, is the competitive advantage or confidentiality. The factories are concerned that if they share their suppliers with their client, then maybe their client will go around them. Well, using apparel, continue to use apparel, or a retail client isn't going to go direct to a mill and then arrange, in most cases, I mean, there may be some very large retailers who arrange raw materials and the cut and sew, but most buyers aren't going to go to the mill and then go separately find a factory or a workshop that can cut and sew and maybe in between there a dye. So a factory needs to be confident in the value add services they provide and realize that their clients aren't conducting audits to go around them, but to ensure that they're protecting their brand. They're also providing information to their clients. If the end retail client, as you mentioned, if they're concerned or have questions about where goods come from.
Yeah, those are some really great points there, Andy. So these days, a lot of companies that import goods into the US are concerned about the Uyghur Act and the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, the UFLPA, which were enacted a few years ago now. So how are companies using supplier audits like this to navigate the regulatory environment that we're currently in?
So one of the challenges of the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act is that companies have to prove that their goods aren't coming from a certain region, which is difficult. So the part of the reason that many of our clients are implementing supplier traceability audits or mapping audits are so they can attempt to verify or confirm that any components in their goods are not coming from regions that the U.S. government and some other jurisdictions now also are implementing laws from these areas. And so we are doing these audits to show or attempt to show and map out that there aren't any components that are restricted from these regions in the finished goods. U.S. Customs is stopping goods coming in that are have a high probability of having components or raw materials coming from certain areas or from a manufacturer that are already on a blacklist. And these products run the gamut from apparel to electronics, a lot of cotton, there's some medical devices. And so, it is something that is getting much more visibility, especially for our larger clients.
A lot of sense. Now, with regards to our clients, I'm hoping you can give us some examples. So what are some examples of clients that have conducted multi-tier supplier audits to get more visibility, and what was the process like, and what kind of challenges did they face, and what was the end result, and was it worth it?
Yeah. So is it worth it? Well, it's hard for Insight and other service providers to always quantify what the value or potential savings is for our clients because we're only a piece of the pie. So we don't end up seeing when something isn't impounded at customs. That's not considered necessarily a win, but it's definitely a loss when something does get, subject to further investigation. So the way it looks like when Insight is engaged to conduct mapping supplier traceability audits is that we would go into a factory and look at incoming raw material records. You know, what are the processes in place that a factory has to verify that the goods they receive are, one, regulatory compliant, but also coming from the supplier that they're purchasing. So we would look at their records, and then we would go back another level. So if an apparel factory receives fabric that's been dyed and they're buying it from the dyer, then going back and where's the mill? Where did the mill obtain the cotton? So ensuring that the cotton farm is not located in a geographic area that is restricted for import into the States from raw materials from that area, components. So it would, in apparel, it would be going from the factory all the way back to the cotton farm in one piece. We're doing a new supplier mapping project now that has to do with resins and plastics. You know, so there's a lot of electronic components are subject to, or have electronic products have components that come from ores and minerals that are, you know, from the some of these areas. So, you know, it's important and not necessarily very easy to conduct these mapping exercises, but it is something that can be done with education of the factory, addressing the concerns that I mentioned earlier about confidentiality and trade secrets, and, you know, not wanting their suppliers' information to become public knowledge or to be circumvented. So, you know, that, and we take, and our clients take great care in sharing the reasons behind and addressing those issues with their factory partners, because they do consider them partners. It's not to circumvent, it's to ensure that they minimize the odds of their goods being subject to more scrutiny upon import.
So I'd like to just wrap this up by asking, you know, if someone is thinking about conducting their own supplier audits and they want to improve their supply chain visibility, what advice would you give to them about how to approach the situation? And what pitfalls should they avoid? And what are the biggest benefits?
So I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give on how to approach is communication. Communicating with the factory partners why the audits are being done and undertaking is very important. So to address any issues that are concerned by the factory of being circumvented. So, you know, that's a big piece, is communication, understanding what the objective is. Is it to meet the requirements of the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act? Is it, you know, what is the objective and the goal? And so, you know, that is key. And then what is the desired end result? It's to map out suppliers of our clients' products to ensure that there aren't any components coming from restricted areas.
Okay, so thank you for joining me today, Andy, to talk about supply chain visibility and auditing suppliers. And to our viewers, you know, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us. And also, if you'd like to learn more about how you can work with us to conduct your own supplier audits, please feel free to reach out for that as well.
So, thanks, Billy, for this little session on traceability, visibility into supply chain. As you mentioned, it's very important for our clients to understand and ensure that the components in their products aren't coming from restricted areas. So if you have any questions, reach out. Have a good day.